Welcome back to Thinking Readers, where children listen to stories and learn to think. Today is day 17 of our story advent calendar. Yesterday, we read one of Aesop's fables, The Jay and the Peacocks. We learnt the word treachery, and we figured out what a fable was. We found lots of information in the fable about what jays can do. I had no idea they were so talented. And the task I left you with was to think about what was unique, special, or very much you. Did you have a chance to think about something that you could do very well or something that was special about you? I hope that you did, and I hope you shared it with someone, either a parent, pet, or toy. I had a word with horse, still feeling bad about the comment I made about donkey earlier. And I shared with horse something about me which is very quirky. I have this knack of being able to meet somebody and know something about them before they've even told me. And I really don't know how I do it, but I just get a sense of something when I meet people. It could be that I read so many stories, that I've seen so many different characters in my life, and things seem familiar. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's very much me. Our story today is about a character that doesn't have any problems thinking about his good qualities. Our story today is The Wombles by Elizabeth Beresford. Let's have a look at the front cover and see this womble in flight. I wonder what sort of adventure it's going to be in our first chapter today. Chapter 1, Bungo. Once upon a time, the Wombles went to live on, or rather under, Wimbledon Common in southwest London. There may be other Womble families in different parts of the world. In fact, there are, but the Wombles like to keep themselves to themselves, so once they've made a move and built themselves a nice, comfortable, waterproof burrow, they tend to stay where they are. The head of the Wimbledon Wombles is Great Uncle Bulgaria. He is very old indeed, and his fur has turned snow white, and he feels the cold rather badly. So during the winter months, he mostly sits in his own room in a large rocking chair, wearing a tartan shawl and 2 pairs of spectacles. He uses one pair for reading the Times, and the other for looking at young Wombles who have misbehaved. And as this pair makes his eyes look enormous, it has a very alarming effect. Many a young Womble has come out of Great Uncle Bulgaria's room with his or her fur standing up on end and his or her teeth chattering. As well as the rocking chair, there's a footstool and an electric fan. Years and years ago, when Great Uncle Bulgaria's fur was just turning from grey to white, he had a coal fire which gave a lot of trouble. If the wind was blowing a certain way, his room used to get full of smoke, which made him cough. And even worse, when the wind was not blowing at all, the smoke went straight up the chimney and through the bracken, and the common keepers would go and stamp all over the ground, thinking it was a fire in the bushes. And when they did that, pieces of mud fell down the chimney into Great Uncle Bulgaria's room and made a dreadful mess and even more of a dreadful smell. So Tobermory, who was very clever with his paws, made an electric fire out of bits of this, pieces of that, and it makes the room nice and warm and gives no trouble at all. And last, but very important indeed, there is Great Uncle Bulgaria's atlas. It's very large and very old, and some of the pages have gone brown around the edges and come loose as well, although Tobermory has done his best to keep them in place with strips of sticky paper. It's a job which he dislikes because the sticky paper gets stuck to his fur, and the more he tries to get it off, the more it sticks. So many of the maps have pieces of fur down the sides. The atlas is important because each Womble chooses their name out of it. Some of them spend a long, long time looking at all the different parts of the world to find just what will suit them. and some of them merely shut their eyes tight and point and hope for the best. Which is how Bungo got his name. "Serves you right," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "I don't care, I like it," said Bungo. "Ho-hum," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "Bungo it is then. Silly sort of name, but it quite suits you. Now then, young Womble, you're old enough to start work, which means you'll be going out on the common on your own. And that means you'll come across people. And people are very strange creatures." "I know," said Bungo. "No, you don't. There's a lot you don't know. In fact, there's precious little you do know. Stand up straight and don't slouch. People are strange because they're untidy, because they sometimes don't tell the truth, and because most of them are so interested in their own affairs that they just don't notice us. If possible, you should avoid them. But if, for one reason or another, you have to speak to a human being, always be polite and helpful. The chances are that they'll never even notice you're a womble at all. But it's better to be safe than sorry, so don't go looking for trouble. Now off you go and start work. Bungo indeed." And Great Uncle Bulgaria picked up the Times and shook out the pages and began to read. So Bungo went off feeling a bit foolish, which was most unusual for him, as he was quite certain that he was the bravest, most adventurous, and perhaps even the handsomest of all the Wombles. He trotted down the long underground passage past all the small side turnings till he came to a door with "Workshop" written on it. Come in," said Tobermory's gruff voice when Bungo knocked. Bungo had never been in the workshop before, and he went in rather timidly, and his small eyes grew large as he looked about him. It was a big room with rows and rows of shelves all around the walls, and each shelf was stacked high with all kinds of things: gloves, shoes, gumboots, scarves, cameras, balls, rackets, skates, fishing rods, sticks, handbags, wallets, sweaters, socks, jars, bottles, thermos flasks, papers, books, watches, brooches, necklaces, hats, suitcases, raincoats, baskets, buckets, all kinds of money, and a lot more besides. All of them in great neat piles, and each pile neatly labelled, for the Wombles are the tidiest creatures in the world. And as if that wasn't enough to be going on with, there were other rooms beyond with racks of larger objects: bicycles and tricycles, scooters, prams and deck chairs, wheels and tables, and even parts of cars and caravans. "Well," said Bungo, slowly turning round and round. "Aha!" said Tobermory, who was taking a radio to pieces on the workbench. His fur was turning grey, and he wore a large apron and had a screwdriver tucked behind an ear and a pencil behind the other ear. "Well, well, well," said Bungo. "What do you think of it, eh?" said Tobermory, his sharp eyes looking at Bungo, although his busy paws never stopped working. "It's very big, isn't it?" said Bungo. "There are such a lot of things. Do they all come from—" and he jerked his head up towards the ceiling. "That they do. All left by the people out on the common. Pass me that tin marked screws, young Womble." "I've got a name now. Bungo cleared his throat and looked rather shyly at Tobermory as he handed over the tin. "I'm Bungo. I chose it." "Sort of name you would choose. Silly sort of name. Yes, all my stores come from the common. Human beings are an untidy lot. They'd lose their arms and legs if they weren't joined on tight. So, you're old enough to start work, eh? Go and find yourself a basket. Over there, young Womble, on that shelf marked baskets. Can't you read?" "Of course I can," said Bungo, rather hurt. But Tobermory was holding an old radio up to his ear and shaking it, and he didn't seem to hear. So Bungo sighed and went over to the shelf where he picked out a large straw basket. "Nice bit of work, that," said Tobermory, putting down the radio and looking at the basket. "Hardly had to mend it at all when it was brought down to me, just a stitch or two. Now remember, young Womble, it's our duty to keep the common tidy. Just do your work properly and mind out for dogs. Dogs don't like Wombles, and Wombles don't take kindly to dogs. Remember that. Now, off you go, I'm busy." "I'm not afraid of dogs," said Bungo. "More fool you then," said Tobermory. "Shut the door behind you." Bungo had been looking forward to his first working day. For it's the point in a Womble's life when he feels nearly grown up. He has his own name at last, and he's considered old enough and clever enough to venture out into the outside world. In fact, Bungo had spent the last few nights imagining just how important he would feel and what a chance it would be to prove how brave and adventurous he was. But neither Great Uncle Bulgaria nor Tobermory had made a fuss of him. Indeed, they'd called his splendid new name silly. "I'll show 'em," muttered Bungo, doubling up his paws as he hurried down the passage. "And if I meet any dogs, I'll show them too." And he gave a hop, skip and a jump because he suddenly felt excited again. He pretended not to see the other young Wombles whom he passed, and his nose was very much in the air until he reached the main door, which opened out onto the commons. Sitting beside the door and reading a comic very slowly was the night watch Womble, Tomsk. He blinked sleepily at Bungo, asked his name, and wrote it down carefully in a large book. Then he unlocked the door and opened it, and at once Bungo could smell the cool dawn air and hear the birds and a dog barking in the distance, and all at once he didn't feel quite so brave at all. However, he couldn't let Tomsk know that, so Bungo whistled softly to himself and then hummed as the door was shut behind him. And then very, very slowly he walked up the last winding passage until there was nothing between him and the outside world but bushes and ferns. Bungo's nose appeared first, and then his bright little eyes, and then his round furry body. As he was not very tall, he couldn't see much except the tops of the bushes, which were laced with spiders' webs and dew that glittered and danced in the early morning sunlight. Bungo parted the bushes and edged his way between the leaves and grunted to himself as he made for the patch of common which he was to look after. It was not a very large piece, but it had got a wooden bench on it, and Bungo knew, from listening to the conversations of the other Wombles, that where there was a seat for human beings, there was also bound to be something to tidy up. He soon noticed some pieces of paper, and within a few seconds Bungo's paws had picked up 2 chocolate bar wrappers, a handkerchief with D. Smith on it, and an evening paper. Said Bungo, feeling quite a Womble of the world. "They're an untidy lot, these humans." Once he started looking, it was really astonishing how much there was to find. A pencil, 1/2 of a return ticket to Victoria Station, quite a long piece of string, and a library ticket were soon added to Bungo's collection, and he became so pleased with himself that he completely failed to notice 2 things. First, that the barking dog was getting closer all the time, and second, that there was somebody sitting on the bench, until, just as he was about to seize a rather battered straw hat with both eager paws, a voice said, almost in Bungo's horrified ear, "And what do you think you're doing, may I ask?" "Eep," said Bungo, diving under the seat and covering his ears with his paws. "That," said a voice, "is my hat, I'll have you know." Bungo opened one eye and looked up and into the eyes of somebody who was leaning right over him and looking down. Although the face was, of course, upside down, Bungo recognised it, and his heart stopped making a loud banging noise, and he said weakly, "It was a joke." "Poof!" "It was," said Bungo, climbing out from under the seat and smoothing some of the grass off his fur. I knew it was your hat all the time, Orinoco." "Poof," said Orinoco, who was the stoutest and laziest of all the Wimbledon Wombles. He sat back on the bench and put on the straw boater and tilted it over his eyes. He was also wearing sunglasses and a long overcoat, rather stained about the middle buttons. And at his side was a walking stick with a very pointed end and an extremely small paper carrier bag, which was quite empty. "I'm Bungo now," said Bungo. "I always like to sit in the sun," said Orinoco, taking no notice. "A bit of sun does you a power of good. Hello, there's a dog coming. What shall we do?" asked Bungo, starting to tremble and quite forgetting a short while ago he'd been so brave about dogs. But then he'd only ever seen a small one, and this dog was enormous, with white fur and black spots and a long tongue. "Do? I shan't do anything," said Orinoco. "I haven't had my 40 winks yet." Bungo looked at Orinoco, who'd folded his paws across his stomach, and then at the dog, which was racing towards them, and 1 second later, Bungo, that adventurous and fearless Womble, was running too. Across the grass he went with his ears back and his breath coming in great gasps until he reached the nearest tree, and up he clambered until he was lost among the golden yellow leaves. The dog pranced and danced around the bottom, and far up above, Bungo shut his eyes and dug his claws into the wood and wished very hard indeed that he was just a young Womble again and safe deep inside the burrow. "Rrrr," said the Dalmatian, pawing at the tree trunk. "Come here, Fred," said the Dalmatian's owner, striding across the grass towards the bench where Orinoco was now gently snoring. Much to Bungo's relief, the Dalmatian shook his head and then reluctantly retreated to where its owner was about to sit down on the bench. Bungo parted the leaves and watched with his mouth open as he remembered Great Uncle Bulgaria's words of warning about mixing with human beings. There was a terrible story that once, long ago, a Womble had been taken away by some men and had never come back. What had happened to him nobody knew, and Bungo shivered so hard as he remembered this awful tale that the leaves shook gently. "Lovely morning, sir," said the man, sitting down and hanging on tightly to his dog's collar to stop it from sniffing around Orinoco's ankles. "Zzz," said Orinoco sleepily. He was dreaming of breakfast, and he scratched his stomach contentedly at the thought of food. The man moved away slightly, pulling his dog with him. The dog whined and showed his teeth, and Bungo trembled so violently that some leaves drifted down off the tree. "A very mild autumn we're having," the man said. Said Orinoco, licking his lips as a picture of blackberries and cream slid before his eyes. "Well, I must be getting along," said the man rather nervously. It's a strange noise, especially when made by a stranger. "Oof," said Orinoco, blowing out his cheeks and having a really good scratch. "Nice meeting you," the man said. "Come along then, Fred." And he caught hold of the Dalmatian's collar and pulled him away and went off very quickly without looking back. It wasn't until he was quite out of sight that Bungo slid down the tree and then, still feeling rather shaky, went over to Orinoco and nudged him. "What's that?" said Orinoco, sitting bolt upright. "Oh, it's you again. What a restless creature you are. Isn't it breakfast time yet? Where's my hat?" "On your head," said Bungo. "Weren't you frightened of that man and his dog?" "Man? What man? Dog? What dog?" said Orinoco, yawning. Then he took off his sunglasses and looked at Bungo, and his eyes weren't at all sleepy as he added, "When I've got these spectacles on, there's a lot I don't see, although I'm not saying I miss much, such as young Wombles who run away from dogs. But," said Bungo, shuffling his paws, "or," said Orinoco, picking up his stick, "I might notice that my tidy bag's rather empty, while somebody else's basket's quite full. But," said Bungo, and then stopped and thought for a bit. And then he sighed and picked up his basket and began to take out some of the things to put them in the bag. Nothing like a nice nap in the sun to make you feel fit, said Orinoco, shutting his eyes again. That evening, Tobermory went along to have a good night chat with Great Uncle Bulgaria. He was just finishing the back page of the Times. Sit down, said Great Uncle Bulgaria, pushing over the stool. Tobermory sat down and spread out his paws to the electric fire. Nothing to read in the paper these days, said Great Uncle Bulgaria, hitching his tartan shawl more firmly around his shoulders. Well, how's young Bungo? Silly name. How's he coming along? He'll do, said Tobermory, and smiled to himself behind his paw. Thinks he's the greatest womble in the world at the moment. You'll soon get that kicked out of him, one way or another. He's young yet, said Great Uncle Bulgaria, and for a moment the two wise old Wombles looked at each other, and then Great Uncle Bulgaria got out the chess game which he and Tobermory had been playing for years. Quite soon both of them had forgotten about Bungo. And as for Bungo himself, he was fast asleep with a happy smile on his face, for he was dreaming that he was chasing an enormous black and white Dalmatian clean across Wimbledon Common, while all the other Wombles watched admiringly. Dear Bungo. Let's see if we can recap the story. You know what to do. Bungo lives under Wimbledon Common with the other Wombles, and he is old enough now to choose his name and get to work cleaning up the common. So off he goes to work, and he runs away from a dog, hides up a tree, and ends up having to give Orinoco all his rubbish to stop Orinoco telling everybody about the dog. What opinion does Bungo have of himself? There were lots of superlatives at the beginning. He thinks he is the bravest. He is the most adventurous. He is the handsomest of all the other Wombles. In fact, when he passes the Wombles, he's going up to the common for the first time. What does he do? How does he act? He sticks his nose in the air as if he's better than them. When Tobermory tries to help him and give him some advice, what does he say? I know about humans. I'm not afraid of dogs. Full of bravado, isn't he? When he gets to the common, is he all those things that he thinks he is? Is he the bravest, the most adventurous? Does he know about dogs and humans? He doesn't, does he? Now, Uncle Bulgaria and Tobermory, how did they treat him? They're a little bit dismissive of him. They're a bit rude about his name, and they sort of say, he doesn't know anything. And he says that they don't really make a fuss of him, even though this is a very important day for him. He's going out to work for the first time. He's got his name. But what did you notice at the end of the chapter when they were talking about him? Tobermory said he was okay and that he would learn, and Uncle Bulgaria said he's young yet. So you can see behind the scenes, they're just trying to teach Bungo, and they know he's very young. Even though Bungo is a bit arrogant or big-headed, Why might we still like him? Was there anything in the story that made you think, oh, I like Bungo? He's quite sweet-natured, isn't he? And quite sensitive. So his feelings are a little bit hurt by the way that they're dismissing his name and the way that they talk to him and don't make a fuss about him. He's also quite resilient, because at the end, despite this misadventure with the dog, there he is, reversing the situation. He's chasing the dog with all his friends watching. He's got an indomitable spirit. Often, a narrator will set a character up to fail. So right at the beginning of the chapter, the narrator tells us that this is Bungo's opinion of himself. And we sort of sense by the hint that there's going to be a human encounter, there's going to be an encounter with the dog, that something's going to happen to Bungo. Anyone has an inflated opinion of themselves, the writer's going to take them down. How do the Wombles choose their names? An atlas is a collection of maps, a big book with lots of different maps inside it, and the Wombles are allowed to pore over these maps until they find a place that really they feel they can connect with, that represents them. And I suppose Bungo's personality means that he was just a little bit wild and hit and miss and just landed on Bungo. Bungo is a town in Angola, which is a country in Africa. But frankly, is Bungo any worse a name than Tobermory or Bulgaria or any of the other names that we heard? I think it's a fine name, but it was the way that he went about choosing it, I think, that didn't impress a Great Uncle Bulgaria, that he was just very careless about it. This particular book is similar to the Enchanted Wood and the Pepperpot stories in that a lot of the chapters are separate little stories of their own. So they're great fun to read if you have just a little bit of time and you want to read a whole story. And it's really satisfying to complete a whole story in an evening. Your task for today is to find your own name from an atlas or a map or a globe, or by thinking about some places you might have been. You can even think about your local area. A map can be of a very small area. It can even be of your house. A map doesn't have to be of a country or anywhere large. It can just be of a very small area. So pick something that you think describes you and say why. I think it's time for me to find some better names for donkey and horse. So I'm going to spend some time thinking about that. That's it for today, but I will see you tomorrow for day 18 of our Story Advent Calendar. Goodbye.